I didn't throw a party when I mailed the last check. I mowed the lawn and folded the receipt into the pocket of my cutoffs and watched the flag at the end of my street move just enough to make the hot June air pretend it was helpful. And that was celebration enough for me. If you've ever waited for a letter with your name and the words "paid in full," you know the feeling isn't loud. It just sits inside your ribs like something finally put down where it belongs. 2 days later, when my brother's wife stood on my porch with a plastic tote and the sentence, "It's family property," balanced on her tongue like a thing she'd practiced, the flag didn't move at all, and I realized quiet can hold completely different things. My name is Erin Cole. I am 29 years old. And this took place over June and July on a half-mile loop in a subdivision 10 miles outside Dayton, where the HOA sends emails about mailbox paint codes, and the local news spends 3 minutes on high school baseball highlights even in the off-season. I bought my place 4 years ago, a cedar-sided 2-bedroom on a small lot with a maple that drops helicopter seeds like confetti in May. I took on the soft spots in the floor and the cranky water heater one weekend at a time. And I made a deal with myself that every overtime dollar from the clinic went to the principal until I could stand in this house without the feeling I had borrowed air from someone else's lungs. When the letter came on the first Monday of June, thick paper with my name printed straight, I put it under a magnet shaped like a tomato on my fridge and let it stare me down while I ate leftover lasagna and half listened to the baseball game through the wall from my neighbor's den because they keep their TV on just loud enough to be a soundtrack for my kitchen. On Wednesday, I told my mom over dinner at her place that the loan had been cleared, and she cried the quick way she does, like her eyes were already ready. And my dad squeezed my shoulder and said something about the value of a fixed roof and a short commute. And my brother Tyler nodded and asked what it felt like to own something outright, and I said it felt like nothing and everything, and my sister-in-law Kelsey chewed her salad and didn't add anything for the first 20 minutes. It started at my front door 2 evenings later, when the sky went that flat blue it goes in June right before the heat lets go of the day. I had just put out the trash and waved to Mr. Poe across the street because he waters his hanging baskets every night at the same time, and the air smelled like cut grass and charcoal because somebody 3 houses down had decided burgers were easier than thinking. Kelsey pulled up to my curb with her hazards blinking and the plastic tote already in her arms, and she stepped onto my porch like she was balancing a tray she didn't want to drop. "Hey," she said without the rest of a greeting. "I'll take the office room. We'll be out of your way." I thought I'd misheard her. I said because it was what my mouth found. "Me and Ty," she said, shifting the tote and looking past me into my front hall. "It's family property. It makes the most sense for us to be here while we figure out the mortgage mess and the school zoning." The word mess sat between us like a smell. I asked her to back up and tell me what she was talking about, and she told me Tyler's hours had been cut, daycare was due, her car needed work, and their landlord had decided to sell to a cousin, and this house, my house, had been bought with family help. So it was ours as long as any of us needed it. "I didn't take money from Mom and Dad for the down payment," I said, and I could feel my pulse notch up a half step even though my voice sounded like it belonged to any other kitchen conversation. "Grandma gave me $5,000 on my 25th birthday, the same as she gave you too, and I saved and worked overtime, and the rest I handled by not doing anything expensive for 4 years. There isn't a we in the deed." Kelsey set the tote down with that soft thump plastic makes when it knows you're trying to be delicate, but aren't. "Your mom told me she helped you with closing costs," she said, which would have been funny if it hadn't been about my front door. My mom had insisted on buying my new place a pack of dish towels and a plant that died after one winter. "She bought me a fern," I said, and then I heard my own voice doing that thing where it repeats the simple truth like you do when you're talking to someone who has decided up means down. "Well, the spirit of this house is family, Kelsey said, and somewhere behind her the neighbor's TV called a double to left-like punctuation. I told her to hold on, picked up my phone, and called Tyler. He answered on the second ring with the sound of a cart beeping in the background, like he was at the grocery store picking up the cheap chicken. "Kels is at my door with a tub," I said. "She says it's family property." "What's going on?" He did that sigh he learned at 13 that tries to be older than it is. "We just need a couple of weeks to land," he said. "You got space. It's not like you're using the second bedroom for anything but houseplants and boxes." I looked behind me at the room with the drafting table and the old rug I rolled out for yoga and the half-finished shelf I had sanded the night before, and I wished for a second I did keep boxes in there so I could point. "No," I said, simple as the fern. "You cannot move in. You can sleep on my couch 2 nights while you line up a sublet. Bring earplugs." The neighbor falls asleep with baseball on, and it runs at a low murmur until midnight. Kelsey's face did a thing that would have read as a smile to a stranger who didn't know her tells. "You want to lock your family out of family property," she said, and it was more sentence than question. I told her the couch offer stood through Sunday night because Monday I had early patients and needed my house to smell like my house and not like somebody else's takeout. And that's when she took a step toward the doorframe like a person trying to test whether a grocery cart will fit through a narrow aisle. I put my hand up, palm open, like you do when a kid's scooter is aimed at your ankle. "Do not cross this threshold with that tub," I said, and my voice felt like it had hit a line I didn't know I knew was there. She called me selfish with a little flourish on the last syllable, picked up her tote, turned so fast her ponytail swatted her collarbone, and walked it back to the curb with a stomp that made the plastic sing. The next morning, the HOA email was titled "Friendly Reminder About Guests," and the second paragraph described how overnight guests should be registered if staying more than 3 nights in a month. And I knew it was about Mrs. Morton's cousin in 6C who had parked his work van in the visitor lot for 2 weeks, but the timing made the skin between my shoulder blades go warm anyway. I drank my coffee standing at the sink because my legs wouldn't hold still, and I walked around my kitchen without touching anything just to wear some of the energy down to a place that wouldn't burn me. At 10 on the dot, my mom called to invite me to Sunday lunch, and I said yes, because I'm not interested in turning my whole life into a courtroom, and before she hung up she said, "Kelsey seemed upset last night. Did she catch you at a bad time?" And I told my mom that anytime someone tries to move into your house without your permission is a bad time, and she didn't laugh, which told me she had already gotten a different story. Sunday lunch has been at my parents' place since forever. My dad insists on the second service because he likes the hymns and the way the pastor manages to pronounce all the names in the Old Testament without looking at notes. And afterward, we gather in their kitchen where the air always smells like lemon cleaner and the food smells like butter, and the conversation tries very hard to stay ordinary. This Sunday, the second Sunday of June, the ceiling fan clicked once every 3 rotations the way it always does, and Tyler set down a bag of rolls and didn't look at me, and Kelsey folded a dish towel onto her shoulder like she was hosting and said, "We should bless the food, it might help," which was a sentence that could have been sweet in a different month. My dad asked me to tell the story of the letter from the bank because he likes to hear good news straight from the person who earned it, and I did. And my mom clapped softly like you do at preschool graduations because she believes in making happy things just a little bigger. Then Kelsey cleared her throat and said, "It was paid off with family help, so we're all on the same team here," and she used her gentle voice that always makes me feel like I'm being introduced at a school assembly. I said, "It was paid off with overtime and a lot of quiet Fridays," and she said, "Your grandmother's gift counts as family money," and I said, "She gave the same to you," and Tyler finally looked up and said, "We're not trying to take anything. We just need a place to land," and my dad wiped his mouth with his napkin even though he hadn't eaten yet and said, "Let's keep the temperature down," and my mother's wedding ring clicked once against her glass, and the word Kelsey chose for me landed like a bug on the lasagna, and then sat there while the air pretended not to notice. "You're acting like street garbage with a new coat of paint," she said, very evenly, not loud, and for a second I thought my hands would stop being attached to my body because they went warm and numb at the same time. And I looked at my dad because the next move in the house has always been his, and he told her to watch her tone because we don't call names at this table, and she said she hadn't called a name, she'd made an observation. And my mom picked up the dish towel off Kelsey's shoulder and set it on the counter like she was putting down a weapon. We ate anyway because that's what people do when they don't want to make something even bigger, and when the game came on in the den, my dad turned the volume up to the place where it could cover the sound of a disagreement without drowning out the statistics. And Kelsey talked about the price of gas like that was the only thing making her head throb, and I kept my fork moving because if you let a meal sit after a word like that, it spoils everything else on the plate. After I helped my mom stack the plates by the sink, I stepped onto the back porch to breathe the air that lives between the smells of grass and grill smoke, and Tyler followed me like he was attached with a short piece of string. "She shouldn't have said that," he said, and his voice had dropped into that young place I remembered from when he used to practice apologies in the mirror, because our grandmother made him learn them like piano scales. "No," I said, "she shouldn't have," and I waited for him to pick the next line, and he said, "If you let us stay 2 weeks, you can set all the rules. She'll calm down," and I said, "That word doesn't get to live in my house." 2 nights, for the couch still stands. After that, no. He put his hands on his hips the way our dad does when he's about to discuss logistics, and he said, "You think you earn this alone," and I told him the truth you tell when you're trying to care for a person and the property line at the same time. "I didn't do it alone," I said. "Neighbors didn't play music after 10. Mom and Dad answered calls when I was ripping up the kitchen and couldn't remember how to shut the water off. Grandma bought me a fern. But the deed ends with my name, Ty. That's what the magnet on my fridge is holding up. By Tuesday, in the quiet space between the morning rush and the afternoon appointments at the clinic, the text thread with my parents had turned into a negotiation without a table. Kelsey sent a message that said, "We will arrive with a U-Haul Friday evening. Please have the room ready." And my mom replied with a string of question marks, because she is still surprised when people put commands in writing to family, and I wrote, "Do not come here with a truck. You will not be allowed inside," and my dad called me to ask if we could all take a breath and see if new language might help. That night I printed the deed and the release letter, and I set them under my magnet beside my grocery list and the coupon for oil changes I keep forgetting to use, and the paper sat there making its own kind of sense. On the 3rd Wednesday of June, after work, a police cruiser rolled into our subdivision slow enough to make the dogs watch and parked halfway up my block and then moved on. It had nothing to do with me. It was a missing bike from 3 streets over. But I felt my chest pull tight anyway because I could see the next scene in this play if someone wrote it wrong. I told myself to unclench and went to the backyard to pull weeds because there are not a lot of problems a person can solve without a tool, but a dandelion and a firm grip is one of them. Friday arrived with all the noises it usually brings: mowers, delivery trucks, kids riding bikes in loops because school had finally done us the favor of becoming a memory, and at 5:30 Kelsey texted, "On our way," as if I had invited her. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Diaz, who sits on the HOA board and has a way of making unpleasant topics slide into polite conversation without losing their corners. She walked over with a clipboard and said she would sit on my porch with me until whatever was going to happen had the decency to do it in daylight. Tyler's pickup came first, and then a small rental truck with a dolly strapped to the side and a bumper sticker about "Family First" that would have made me laugh if my throat hadn't been dry. They parked nose to nose at my curb like the beginning of a standoff in a movie that wants to be about honor. Kelsey hopped out in shorts and a tank top that said weekend mode, and she grabbed the dolly with a flourish that would have gotten an extra point in a cheer competition. And she aimed it at my porch steps like nobody had ever told her no in a sentence longer than one syllable. I stood, not dramatic, not loud, just in the spot where my flower pots start and the welcome mat ends. "This is not happening," I said, and she laughed the way someone laughs when they get to use a line they rehearsed. "It's family property," she said, and my pulse did the thing that makes the corners of your eyes go sharp, and I told her to set the dolly down and back her truck up because she was blocking a fire hydrant, and she said she would be done in an hour, and Mrs. Diaz said very evenly that vehicles cannot block hydrants even for 10 minutes per the HOA and the city, and then she took a photo of the bumper because she documents everything and probably has 3 envelopes labeled parking. Tyler stood on the grass with his hands in his pockets like he didn't know which side of the fence he belonged on, and I said, 2 nights on the couch, starting tonight if you want it. After that, no, and Kelsey said, "We don't need your couch. We need the office," and I told her the office was where I keep my quiet, and I was not loaning out my quiet to anyone who called me what she had called me. She tilted the dolly up like a challenge, and I said, "Kelsey, do not roll that onto my porch," and she pushed the first wheel onto the first step like she wanted to test the edge of my patience to see if I would flinch. "Mrs. Diaz said, I'd like you to stop," and when Kelsey didn't, she pulled out her phone and said, "I am calling the non-emergency line because this is a trespass issue, and I am not interested in being your mediator." The cruiser arrived faster than I expected, probably because they were already in the neighborhood, and the officer stood at the bottom of my porch steps and asked what we had. And I handed him my ID and my deed like a person taking a test she had studied for, and he said, "This is a civil matter, which is the sentence you know is coming when the conflict wears the shape of a family." And he told Kelsey to move her vehicles off the hydrant and not carry anything across a threshold where the homeowner had said no, and she opened her mouth to argue, and he said, gentle but tired, "Ma'am, I'm not here to arbitrate your relatives. I'm here to keep anyone from getting arrested over a dolly." And for a second, I watched her decide whether to make the next choice the kind that leaves a mark. She backed the dolly down the 2 steps like she was the one doing me a favor, and the officer asked everyone to disperse. And he stood in the street until the truck and the pickup were pointed out of the subdivision like a person in a parking lot who knows that sometimes the best help is the kind that removes the exit block. When the red of the brake lights turned, Mrs. Diaz put her clipboard down on my porch table and asked if I had a minute to sit, and my niece said yes, even though my brain said keep moving. And she told me very quietly that the HOA Facebook group had already posted a blurry photo of Kelsey's tank top on my steps and an argument about whether new families get priority for spare rooms. And I put my head in my hands not because I was crying, but because sometimes the weight needs a different place to sit. "You know this is going to come back around tomorrow morning," she said. "There's a yard sale on the next street, and that is just gasoline for stories." I told her I'd set up a table with a toaster I didn't need and a box of paperbacks and a sign that said cash only, because if people were going to walk by my house tomorrow anyway, I might as well keep my hands busy while they turned what they saw tonight into sentences they could use on porches next week. She smiled the way you do when you like a person's nerve even when it's a little bent, and she told me to sleep if I could and to forward her any emails that tried to make this a policy discussion because she is happiest when rules talk instead of people. On Saturday morning, I set out a folding table and a crate of paperbacks under the maple because Mrs. Diaz was right about yard sales being gasoline for stories, and if people were going to slow their cars and look anyway, I preferred they have something to buy. The air smelled like cut grass and hot asphalt. 2 teenagers with a lemonade stand had already set up at the corner with a hand-lettered sign that made the S's look like snakes. And Mr. Poe watered his baskets across the street with the same care a man might use on a new car. I arranged the toaster I didn't need, a pair of lamps I had outgrown, and a box of mason jars I had convinced myself would become a craft project one fall that never arrived. The first neighbors came at 8, polite and curious. They asked about the toaster, pretended not to notice the way my porch looked like a stage that had just been cleared, and paid in small bills that still smelled like a register at the drugstore. A woman I recognized from church, but could not place, asked if I had felt the heat break last night, and then asked if Kelsey had found a place yet without looking at me directly. And I told her I didn't know because the answer that would have satisfied her didn't exist. At 9:15, a white van with a cable logo stopped in front of my driveway, and a young man with a clipboard stepped out squinting at numbers, and I put down the copy of a paperback I had read 3 summers ago and asked if I could help him find an address. He checked his tablet and told me he was there to install service for Tyler Cole, move in today, appointment window 9 to noon, and he said it with the cheerful efficiency of a person who is going to meet their schedule if it kills them. I told him there must be a mistake because no one was moving in and no account would be installed today, and he shrugged like the tablet outranked me and said if the order was wrong they would charge a cancellation fee to the person listed, and I told him to note, "Order canceled by property owner," and he typed without arguing because typing pays him by the hour and arguing does not. At 10, the mail carrier rolled up with the easy gate he uses when the dogs on our street have learned his scent and stopped ringing alarms about it, and he handed me 3 envelopes and a smile I don't see when he's doing the second loop in rain. One was a pile of grocery coupons I would never use. One was a lawn service flyer folded by a machine that didn't care about straight lines, and one was a thick piece from the county auditor's office addressed to resident parcel ID. That made my palms go warm the way they do when someone says my name too loudly at the wrong time. I opened it standing at the end of my driveway because whatever was inside didn't deserve the shade of my porch, and the letter explained in polite printed paragraphs that a homestead exemption application had been submitted online for my parcel listing the applicant as Kelsey Cole, and that the office required verification of residency from the titled owner or would deny in 30 days. And my mouth went dry not because I didn't understand the words, but because I understood them too well. My mail carrier watched my face with that careful look people use when they've seen a lot of human weather and don't want to step directly into the storm. "You also got 2 pieces yesterday," he said, tapping his satchel. "Change of address forms for mail rerouting. Your address listed as the destination." I flagged them for verification because they looked busy. He didn't say fishy, he said busy, and I liked him more for that. I asked him how to make sure my mailbox stayed mine, and he told me to sign a simple red card he carried that says no one can change or forward my mail without me standing in front of a counter with my ID. And I signed it with a hand that shook once and then learned its manners. By noon, the yard sale had turned into a neighborhood meeting with transactions attached. People bought my mason jars and told me whether they prefer ball games on the radio or the TV mute with captions. One man paid $5 for a lamp because his kid had started sneaking comic books after lights out, and he remembered the thrill of getting away with it and wanted to make it safer. Kelsey's mother, Rhonda, walked up my driveway with that smile she keeps for choir practice and PTA sign-up sheets, and she picked up a paperback and put it down as if she had been asked to test it for weight. "We're all family here," she said like a person reciting a pledge you're supposed to know, and I told her I agreed with the first 2 words and the last one, but not the arrangement of them in the sentence. And she shook her head the way people do when you say a name wrong on purpose and told me to check my heart before I made choices I couldn't take back. 2 teen boys who had been circling on bikes asked if the toaster worked and if I had any video games, and I told them the toaster made excellent waffles, and that I didn't keep games in my kitchen unless you counted Scrabble, which they did not. And in the middle of answering a question about whether the feet on the toaster were scratched, I felt a wash of heat starting behind my ears because the county auditor letter in my back pocket felt heavier than paper has a right to be. At 2, the wind rose just enough to make the yard sale signs flap against their tape, and I told Mrs. Diaz I needed to go inside and sit by a fan for 5 minutes to remind my body how to act in heat. And she nodded and took my cash box like she had already planned for that possibility. Inside the house, the quiet had a temperature of its own, cooler not because of the thermostat, but because the walls had decided to be on my side. I put the auditor letter next to the deed and took a photo of them together because that image told a story that even my brother would have trouble ignoring, and I sent it to my mom with a line that read, "They tried to take a tax exemption at my address." And to my dad with the same photo because he is the one who calls the question in our family when people are pretending there isn't one. My mom responded with a lightning bolt emoji, which is not her usual language, and then a text that said, "That's not okay," which meant she had crossed a line I needed her to cross. My dad called within a minute, and his first words were not about keeping the temperature down. "Send me the letter front and back," he said. "Do you have the upload confirmation or just the county notice?" And I told him I had what I had because the county had written to me, not to Kelsey, and he said, "Bring it for lunch tomorrow. We'll talk in daylight." And the way he said daylight made me feel like a person being told a highway would be closed for repairs, but that detours had been posted. That night, the AM station said storms might come after 3 in the morning, and the air agreed by making everything stick to everything. I couldn't sleep because my brain kept replaying a dolly wheel on my porch step and a county letter that said my name belonged to my parcel and someone else had tried to borrow it. At a little after 1, a car slowed in front of my house and my stomach did that elevator drop it does when you expect a second floor and the elevator decides to stop at a mezzanine nobody asked for. And I stood very still behind my front window where the curtain covers half your face if you keep to the side, and I watched a silhouette get out, walk to my porch without a dolly or a tote, slide an envelope under my door like a person delivering a menu for a restaurant that didn't exist, and then leave without knocking. I waited until the taillights turned the corner because I wasn't interested in giving anyone what they thought they wanted: a scene, an argument on a Ring camera, a line yelled through a door. And then I picked up the envelope and read the first sentence with my jaw clenched hard enough to make the next morning ache. It was a printout of a post from Kelsey's Facebook, a paragraph about family homes and gatekeeping and blood over paper, with a photo of my porch taken last fall when my pumpkins looked like I had planned their sizes and had not. And under it a comment from a woman I know from church that said, "Praying for soft hearts," which is the specific prayer people use when they want you to move your boundaries for the sake of their comfort. I put the paper on my kitchen table because I refused to let social media live on my fridge next to my grocery list and my tomato magnet, and I made myself a glass of water and drank half of it and thought, very clearly, that I was not going to argue online. I was going to write a letter with dates. The next morning, my mother's kitchen smelled like cinnamon rolls and resolve. She had set out plates, poured coffee, and laid the county letter on the table between the salt and a stack of napkins like it was just another part of Sunday. And when Tyler and Kelsey walked in through the back door, Kelsey did not look at the letter. She said hello like she always says hello to my mom, sweet and high as if they were in a choir rehearsal, and she set a store-bought fruit salad on the counter with a flourish that would have earned a better grade if the class had been grading on packaging. My dad motioned to the table. "We're going to talk, and we're going to use paper," he said, and his voice had the same shape it took the year my grandmother made him sit us all down about the family reunion budget because no one could agree how many hot dog buns constituted enough. I laid the auditor letter flat and slid my deed next to it and handed Tyler and Kelsey copies because I spent part of the night learning the truth that people hold paper more carefully when it looks like it belongs to them. This says someone attempted to claim a homestead exemption on Aaron's parcel, my dad said, tapping the letter with one finger like a metronome. This letter came to Aaron because the property is in Aaron's name. Kelsey, did you submit this form? Kelsey's face went perfectly calm in a way that made my shoulders tighten. Online forms are confusing, she said. I was looking at options to keep taxes from being unfair. Everyone does it, and Tyler said, too fast, we didn't submit that, we were just seeing if we could get an estimate, and my mother said very quietly, you cannot get an estimate on a form that requires someone else's address and name, and then she put her hand over mine under the edge of the table where no one could see and squeezed once and let go. Kelsey reached into her purse, pulled out a folded sheet, and smoothed it flat with the heel of her hand like she was doing the tablecloth a favor. This is what your mother told me, she said, and slid it toward me. It was a photocopy of a recipe card with my mom's handwriting on it, an old blurry index card with a quote my grandmother liked to write on things. Houses are for families. Use them as such, but not a deed, not a contract, not anything that could make water flow uphill. My mom put her hand to her mouth like she does when she is trying to keep a sentence from escaping and said, that card lived in a cookbook. It has nothing to do with anything except your grandmother's ideas about people having soup at a table. And she took the card and set it next to the cinnamon rolls, like she wanted it to absorb the smell of sugar and butter and start behaving. Tyler shifted in his chair like a person whose back has found a bolt he didn't know existed. We can't afford another month where we are, he said. The landlord is raising the rent, and my dad said, your landlord called me Friday because he couldn't get you to pick up, and my brother flinched the tiniest amount because he had not known that connection existed. In our town, people's numbers live in each other's phones for decades. He told me he offered you a month-to-month while you finish a payment plan, and you told him you were moving to family property, and he'd better find a new tenant by July, my dad said. And then he folded his napkin and put it down next to his plate like the conversation had reached a point where both hands needed to be free. The air went quiet in the way air can when everybody is counting their next word. Kelsey said, it's not fair when some people get houses and other people get apartments with laundry down the hall, and my mother said, very gently, life isn't fair, but it can be honest. Those are two different things, and I said, 2 nights on my couch still stands. And Tyler said, we can't bring the kids to a couch, and that was the first time all morning anybody had said kids, and my body did a thing I knew it would, a small internal flinch that was about a desire to protect people who had not done the asking. You do not get to put them between your choice and my house, I said, and I made my voice stay exactly the same speed it had been at the start of the sentence, because speed is a kind of violence all by itself. My dad exhaled in the way he does at the end of the second inning when the pitcher gets the out he needed. We are going to solve 2 problems, he said. Aaron is going to file a no-trespass statement with the police department so we don't have officers on our block again over a dolly. That protects everybody from bad choices. And I am going to help you, Tyler. Talk to your landlord like a grown man and see whether the payment plan stands while you look for a real option you can afford that protects your kids from the kind of bouncing that turns into school chaos in the fall. Kelsey opened her mouth and my dad held up his hand the way he does in the garage when a ladder is sliding 3 inches per second and he wants you to recognize gravity in time. There will be no more talk of family property, unless you are talking about photo albums, he said. We do not take exemptions at homes that do not belong to us. We do not start cable at addresses where we are not invited. We do not register children for a school district using an address that is not our own, and he looked at me when he said the last one because my mother had already set on the table an envelope from the elementary school welcoming a new Cole family, and had not opened it because she wanted the person it belonged to open it with eyes that had not had to hold every other item on this list. After lunch, my mother stacked plates in the sink like she was building something that needed to hold a little while before it slid, and I went to my car with the auditor letter and the deed and the posted welcome letter from the school unopened. And I drove to the police department on the north side where the lobby always smells like a mixture of carpet cleaner and coffee. I told the receptionist I needed to place a no-trespass authorization on file for my address, and she gave me a form with boxes and a blank for persons not authorized, and I wrote Kelsey Cole, Tyler Cole, and my hand shook once less than it had the day before. The woman behind the glass took the sheet and made a photocopy. And she told me calmly that it meant if I called and said someone was on my porch against my instructions, an officer would know I had already given the department the right to remove them without the talk we'd already had on Friday. And she said it in a tone that reminded me of the clinic when the schedule breaks and everybody has to decide to be an adult at the same time. I drove home along the same half-mile I have always driven, and the houses looked like they always look, except now when I looked at my own it felt like my name had gotten a little heavier in a way I could carry. By the third week of June I thought the story might cool down to a simmer. I was wrong. Tuesday evening, while I was patching a drywall nick in the office that had turned into a crack, because the summer air likes to find any excuse to make anything expand, the doorbell rang twice, and then somebody knocked the way you knock when you want the person inside to know you have bones. And when I opened the door, a woman wearing a laminated badge that said school residency stood there with a clipboard and a face that looked like she had eaten a lemon and forgotten to enjoy it. "We need to verify enrollment at this address," she said, and she checked a box on her form without asking if I felt like answering questions. I told her no new Cole family lived here and that she could write denied residency on the line she kept looking at, and she told me she would need something in writing for me to put in the file if I was going to say that with authority. And I told her she would have an email by morning because adults work with paper, and she said, "We prefer PDF," and I nodded because it was the only sane part of the exchange. After she left, I called Tyler because that felt required if not desired, and I told him children did not belong in the space between his problems and my property line, and that I had told the district the truth. He said he had been at work and hadn't known Kelsey had already filled the form out and that he would handle it, and his voice sounded like he was carrying something heavy uphill and wishing somebody else would take a turn. That night my mother texted to say the church prayer chain had sent a message asking people to pray for a home situation involving siblings. And she had spent 15 minutes trying to figure out who had started the chain and given up because anonymous storms are the worst kind. The next day during my lunch break at the clinic, my boss, who pays attention to the local news the way other people pay attention to weather, asked me if everything was all right because the town Facebook page had names without last names on it that could be any of 3 families, but probably ours. And I told him it was being handled and that I was focused on getting the afternoon's blood draw right on the first stick the way I do, and he nodded because I show up on time and he doesn't want to rehire. After work, I swung by the library because sometimes a person needs the smell of pages and quiet in order to remember what not yelling looks like. And the reference librarian who has watched me grow up behind her desk asked if she could help with anything other than the usual summer reading list. And I told her I needed to print a simple letter for the school district and the police department restating the obvious with politeness, and she told me the computers don't bite and the prints cost 10 cents a page, and when I sat to write the letter the words came out like a grocery list, because that is how the truth sounds when you aren't trying to dress it up for company. I wrote, "To whom it may concern, I am the sole owner of address. No other Cole family occupies or is authorized to occupy this residence. I did not and do not consent to any residency claims, homestead exemptions, or service installations by any person other than myself." I signed it, I made 2 copies, and I put them in my bag with the same feeling you get when you remember you packed water before a long walk. The 4th Saturday of June should have been quiet because the heat told everybody to stop pretending they wanted to do anything other than sit with a fan, but nothing this month had any interest in being normal. I woke to the sound of a truck idling outside my window and a hand on my door that was not my own. I walked to the front with a calm I had to build plank by plank and looked through the peephole, and there stood Kelsey with her mother and two men I didn't know, one of whom wore a bright orange t-shirt that said, "We move you," and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I opened the door enough to make it clear I was not a person you sneak up on and told them no one was moving anything into my house and that if they tried to touch my threshold, I would call the police with the no-trespass authorization on file and they could tell the officer they preferred to do paperwork in the back of a cruiser. Kelsey lifted her chin and said, "We're here for the couch," like I had offered her a sofa 12 months ago and not 3 weeks ago. And I told her that offer had a date on it, and the date had gone cold. And she said, "People change their minds." And I said, "Yes, they do." And I closed the door until the sound of the idling engine gave up on itself. That evening, while I was slicing tomatoes for a sandwich and pretending it was too hot to heat anything more complicated, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and I let it go to voicemail because I have learned not to give my peace to unknowns. The voicemail turned out to be the original landlord Tyler had mentioned in his first story. He had gotten my number from my dad after agreeing to stop calling Kelsey because the conversations were not moving any direction that involved a calendar. He kept his voice careful the way landlords who have seen all kinds of summers do and told me he was willing to offer Tyler a short-term month-to-month if someone other than Kelsey would hand him a plan with dates and not slogans. And he said he was sending me by email the copy of the text where Kelsey told him that rent was a fake number when family property existed, and for the first time in 3 weeks I felt not triumph but relief. A thread of evidence that could be tied to another thread. Until something that looked like rope appeared. On the last Monday of June, just as the town seemed to decide fireworks could be heard at any hour without you needing to ask, I walked into the HOA monthly meeting in the community room next to the pool because Mrs. Diaz had suggested I might want a quiet line in the minutes that said the board had been notified of an attempted unauthorized move-in and had documented that the homeowner had declined permission. And when I took a seat in the second row behind the stack of faded pool noodles, I felt 15 pairs of eyes look at me and then look conveniently at the sign-in sheet. The president, a retired math teacher who asks people to show their work when they complain about shrub heights, read the agenda about trash pickup time adjustments, then paused and said, "We have a short homeowner note from Lot 14. And I stood and said my name and said I wanted it in the record that I had filed a no-trespass letter with the police and had declined an unauthorized occupancy attempt by relatives claiming family property, and that any continuing rumors could be directed to me in writing via email because I preferred paper to porches." There was a cough from the back that sounded like the start of an objection. Then there was quiet. Then there was a motion from Mrs. Diaz to append to the minutes that hydrants are not to be blocked even for 10 minutes. And a little wave of relieved laughter went around the room because we are a neighborhood that likes our rules tidy even when the people who need them are messy. I thought that would be my climax for the week. Instead, the knock that landed at 9:45 that night did it. My mom stood on my porch in her house slippers with a tote bag and the kind of expression I have seen 3 times in my life. Once when a doctor said something we didn't expect, once when a cousin left town with a truck he hadn't paid for, and once when my grandmother stopped believing a person's word and asked to see their receipts instead. She sat at my kitchen table and pulled from the tote a single-page printout from her email, a message Kelsey had sent the church women's group asking for extra bedding because we'll be in Aaron's office room for a few weeks and I want to be ready, with a line that said, "Don't tell her. It's a surprise. We're making amends." My mother looked at me and for once didn't try to make the corners smooth. "I should have shut this down sooner," she said. I wanted us all to be on a single page and forgot that sometimes that page becomes a weapon. I told her she had done enough today with the cinnamon rolls and the way she had moved the recipe card to the butter like it belonged there, and I told her she could choose to stand down now without giving up anything important. She nodded and put the printout in my hand like she was passing a baton in a race she was done running. I called the pastor, she said without flourish. He's meeting with them on Thursday. He would like to meet with you if you want, but he doesn't require it, and I told him not to ask you to move a line the county has already printed. On the first Thursday of July, the pastor's office smelled like old coffee and a lemon-scented candle that had been blown out too soon, and I sat in a chair that had the specific give of a cushion that has been apologized into 5 times a week for 15 years. He thanked me for coming in for 15 minutes even though he knew I didn't owe him the minutes. He said he had already met with Tyler and Kelsey and had heard a lot of words arranged to sound like family but not like truth. And he asked me what outcome looked like to me in a sentence I could hold. I told him outcome looked like this. They do not move into my house. They stop using my address. They fix their rental situation like adults. We eat lunch at my parents' house without anyone using the word family like a crowbar. He nodded and said that was 3 sentences, and that was all right because he liked precipices to be described precisely. When I stood to leave, he said a short line I will remember for a long time. People confuse generosity with access. You're allowed to be generous without giving away your front door. I said thank you because no other words felt clean, and I went to the clerk's window at City Hall and handed the woman my letter for the record about the homestead attempt. And she stamped it with a date that made my shoulders drop an inch the way they only do when a person with a stamp gets involved. By the second weekend of July, the heat had settled into the kind that makes the sidewalks look soft around the edges, and the town was busy with fireworks, aluminum pans of baked beans at cookouts, and the sound of baseball games sneaking in through screen doors. My brother texted a picture of his kids eating popsicles on a stoop that did not belong to me and wrote, month to month signed, Kelsey is still mad. I'll call you after work. And I felt that quick throb behind my eyes that means relief might make you cry if you don't give it a different task. So I went to the garage and painted a second coat on the shelf I'd been building for the office. When my phone rang an hour later, it was not Tyler, it was Kelsey. Her voice had none of the sweetness she keeps for my mother. You made me look like a thief, she said, and I said, I didn't need to do anything to make you look that way to the county. The form did that, and she said, you think paper makes you better, and I said, paper makes things clearer. And she hung up because sometimes clarity is the last thing a person wants when their story has been built on smoke. That night the local news showed a segment about heat advisories and hydrant rules, and I laughed once in my living room because somewhere there was a producer who had decided our little block would make a nice reminder. I stood at my kitchen sink and let the water run until the pipes stopped making the small groan they make in July and thought about the last 3 weeks like a row of dominoes I hadn't meant to set up. I had wanted paid in full and quiet dinners and the satisfaction of mowing my own grass and knowing the sound of my own door when it closed. Instead, I got a dolly on my steps, a county letter in my mailbox, a pastor's candle trying to smell like a lemon, and a neighbor who keeps a clipboard like a shield. The act that had started as a hint, that first tote on my porch, had turned into an escalation so inventive I could almost admire it if I hadn't been the target. The discovery had arrived in a mail carrier's satchel and a county seal. The ally had arrived in the form of a woman with a clipboard and another woman who bakes cinnamon rolls when she's done letting people get away with things. It wasn't over yet. I could feel that in the way the air still kept its shoulders up around us. But when I turned off my kitchen light and the neighbor's baseball game hummed through the wall the way it always does, I realized my plan was not revenge so much as a steady return of objects to their names, deed, letter, email, rule. And if the next act wanted to escalate again, my answer was going to be in the same language. The second Friday of July felt like the kind of hot that makes a porch doze, and I thought maybe the month had decided to put down its fists for the weekend. But trouble likes a schedule as much as any of us, and it picked 4:30 in the afternoon to ring my bell. A man with a clipboard and a pin that said code enforcement stood on my steps and read the name of my street twice like he was trying to make sure it was the right one. Behind him, Mrs. Diaz watered her baskets and did not look up. We received an anonymous tip about an unpermitted rental and multiple unrelated people residing here, he said, flipping his sheet over to the part he was supposed to read when people asked him where the complaint came from. I told him there were 0 renters and 1 homeowner and a maple that needs trimming, and he said he would need to step inside to verify, and I said no he would not. He could verify from the threshold with his eyes and his pen. And I brought the no-trespass authorization to the doorway with my driver's license on top and the HOA minutes printed beneath, because paper has started to feel like a cooling towel you can throw over the neck of a situation before it decides to run a fever. He checked his boxes, peered past my shoulder at a living room that smelled like lemon cleaner and ceiling fan dust, and said he would close it out as unfounded and note possible neighbor dispute. And his face did the thing government faces do when they have witnessed the shape of a family argument and want to step away without tracking any of it onto their shoes. I had barely set the papers back under the magnet shaped like a tomato when my phone buzzed again with a number that made my stomach do the small elevator drop it does now. It was the school residency officer following up on my email with a request for a written statement that could be attached to a file and read by someone in August who would not know anyone's names. I wrote it at my kitchen table with the ball game low through the wall from next door and the smell of cut grass drifting in from somewhere, and I kept the language plain because fancy sentences don't hold up to July heat. No Cole family other than me resides at this address. I do not authorize the use of this address for school enrollment by any person, and I added the date because dates are the only reason the next person in line trusts you. I sent the PDF to 2 addresses because I was learning that if a thing is worth saying once, it's worth saying where somebody else can find it when the first inbox goes on vacation. By the 3rd Monday of July, the pastor had met with Tyler and Kelsey and with my parents and then with me alone, and the shape of the week looked like a triangle where all the sides wanted to be the long one. He kept his office at 72 because that's what the church thermostat says is decent in summer, and he poured me water from a sweating pitcher into a cup that had VBS 2014 in faded letters and asked me if I wanted 15 minutes or 20. I said 15 because I did not want to give this month any more of my breath than it had already taken. He didn't talk about forgiveness or grace or any of the words you can buy on a sign at a home store. He asked me what a lift looked like if this were a dance and someone needed to see the mechanics to believe them. I told him it looked like this. No more attempts to use my address for anything. No more knocks after 9. A written do not contact at residence agreement, and a family lunch where we can talk about the Reds bullpen without anyone bringing a tote to my porch. He wrote that down like a nurse taking vitals and said he would carry those lines into Thursday's sit-down. When I walked out into the parking lot, the heat hit my face hard enough to make my eyes blink, and I sat in my car with the AC on and counted my breaths like I used to do when I was learning to run a mile without stopping at the 2/3 mark. And I told myself that if I could get to August without another dolly on my steps, I would buy a new doormat without the word welcome on it and call that a win. The all is lost moment arrived exactly when this month would have chosen it if it could write screenplays, on the last Thursday before payday, when everybody in town is already 3 degrees more irritable than they know. I came home from the clinic to find a notice to quit taped to my front door with blue painter's tape that made my cheeks go hot before my eyes told my brain what the paper actually said. It was a printout from a template site addressed to occupant, family property, and it demanded that I vacate by Sunday at 6 so that rightful family use may commence, and if the paper hadn't been taped to my own door, I might have laughed at the words rightful family use. But the tape was on my paint. And the words were on my glass, and my body did not find any of it funny. For the first time all month, my knees softened in a way that felt like they were considering giving up on holding me upright, and I had to put a hand against the door frame to tell them no. I walked inside, set the paper on the kitchen table, took a picture of it with my phone, and texted it to my dad and Mrs. Diaz and the pastor and the officer whose card the dispatcher had given me the day of the dolly, because we were now a small and unlikely team with a job. My dad called within a minute with a sentence I did not expect. Your grandmother used to say, "Wear good shoes when you walk into foolishness," and I'm putting mine on. I'll be there in 20. And I felt my shoulders drop the way they do when an older person in your life decides they are done pretending they don't see what is on the table. While I waited, I did what I do now when my hands want to make a fist. I made tea I wouldn't drink. I wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. I put the auditor's letter back under the magnet just to feel the pull of something that behaves. And I breathed on a steady count until my mother's car pulled into my driveway, and my dad got out with his hat in his hand like he was going to a meeting with a man who sells tractors. He read the notice and laughed once in a way that didn't feel like laughter, and he taped it back to my door with the tape upside down so it barely held and said, "If they want to take a picture of this for their scrapbook, we can all decide that I also exist in this house." And then he picked up his phone and called the pastor and told him very calmly that the sit-down needed to be tonight, not next week, because paperwork had started to show up on doors, and that is when grown-ups stop waiting for better days. The pastor said his office was open. Mrs. Diaz said she was coming to write the time on a clipboard because she likes her minutes accurate. My mother said she'd bring a plate of something because people sit longer when there is food in a room even if no one touches it. At 7:30, we sat in a circle of chairs that had seen more confessions than most courtrooms, and I watched Kelsey arrive with that calm smile she uses on the church steps when she is collecting sign-ups for potlucks. Tyler looked like he had slept in his car and then ironed his shirt with his hands. My parents took a side-by-side pair because they have learned in 40 years that you can face anything if your chairs touch. The pastor set a small box of tissues on the table and then set a legal pad on top of it, like a lid to remind everyone that tonight was not about crying. He opened with a short prayer that stayed entirely on the ground and then said the plan. We are going to put on paper what will happen and what will not happen, and we are going to do it with the people who can act, not with the people who want to talk for them. He read my 4 lines and then asked if anyone wanted to propose a change. Kelsey spoke first, smooth as the lake at dawn. "We apologize for any confusion," she said, and there was a we where a singular belonged, but the intention was always to make sure that family property did not sit idle when family needed it. Mrs. Diaz clicked her pen once and then stopped herself. The pastor's eyebrows went up a fraction, as if they were calculating square footage. I said, for the record, that the house was not idle, that I work 40 hours and tend the yard and pay the taxes and fold laundry in the living room while the Reds try to keep runners off base. Tyler cleared his throat and did a thing I had not seen him do all month. He sat forward, planted his hands on his knees, and said, "We tried to get the homestead. We tried to set up cable." Kelsey filled out the school form. "I told the landlord we were moving into Aaron's office. I thought if we made enough noise the story would turn into what we said it was. It didn't. That's on me." The room changed shape. My dad looked down at the knot of his tie like it had a message he had forgotten to read. My mother let out a breath that sounded like a small prayer without words. The pastor nodded once, as if a coin had finally landed on the right side. And Kelsey's smile dropped off her face like a towel falling off a rack. She said, "You're throwing me under the bus," and Tyler shook his head and said, "No, I am stepping off the bus I asked you to drive." And then he looked at me and added, "I'm sorry I used the kids as a shield. I won't do that again." The pastor reached for his legal pad and wrote the words "apology accepted" because he likes paper to match the shape of a room, and he slid the pad toward me and asked if I would like to speak. I told them I wanted 3 things signed tonight: a do not contact at residence agreement for both of them, a statement withdrawing any current or future use of my address for any purpose without my written consent, and a line acknowledging the no-trespass authorization on file with the police department. And I said I wanted a copy of the landlord's month-to-month agreement in Tyler's email inbox by noon tomorrow with the words "received" typed back so there would be a timestamp somewhere that wasn't just in my head. Kelsey said that felt punitive and unchristian, and that she would rather we all agree to reset than to get the system involved. And my mother, who rarely steps into a line twice, said, "The system is what people use when they don't want to blow up the porch." And then she opened the plastic lid on her plate of lemon bars and set them on the table without offering one to anybody, because this was not the kind of meeting where sugar fixes anything. We all signed. The pastor witnessed. Mrs. Diaz took a photo of the page with her phone and emailed it to the 3 addresses we wrote down to make sure no one said later that they hadn't gotten the good copy. Tyler texted his landlord a photo of the agreement with the line, "month-to-month accepted. We'll bring deposit 10 a.m. tomorrow," and the landlord replied with a thumbs up and gate code same as last month, which is the kind of sentence that makes your shoulders drop whether you want them to or not. Kelsey didn't eat a lemon bar. She looked at the table like it had betrayed her and said very quietly, "You made us look small," and for the first time I let my frustration do one lap of the room before I brought it back to its crate. "I didn't need to make anything look anyway," I said. "The county and the cable company and the school district and the police and the HOA all use their own fonts. I just put them in a folder." She stood up without asking if anyone else was finished and walked out, the door whispering back behind her like it had learned something too. The last week of July was quieter, not because there weren't a dozen small ways things could flare, but because the people who wanted to flare had signed their names on paper, and that slows a person down. I went to work, drew blood without missing, and told a man in for a fasting lab he could have a donut after if he wanted to, because kindness is free if you keep it in your pocket. The mail carrier waved from his truck and told me the red card was working because the system had kicked back 2 tries at forwarding, and that the busy post office had flagged my address with a little icon that meant "do not reroute without counter signature." And I told him thank you the way you tell a person thank you when they saved you from 6 months of complications you would never be able to name. The HOA sent minutes with a tiny star next to the line about keeping hydrants clear, and no one complained because most people in our neighborhood like certainty more than they like being right. At church on the last Sunday, the pastor chose a hymn I know by number because my grandmother used to sing it while she folded towels, and my mother squeezed my hand on the 3rd verse where the soprano note always wobbles a little, and no one said family property. In the hall, they said things like, "How's your maple doing in this heat?" and "Do you think the Reds can find a closer by September?" And I said the true thing I knew, "We're day by day. We're keeping the corners clean." On August 1st, a date that had circled itself in my mind all month like it wanted to be more than a square on a calendar, I bought a new doormat without the word welcome on it. It has a stripe and nothing else, and when I put it down I felt less like a person closing a door and more like a person saying the doorstep is not an invitation, it is a boundary. I mowed the lawn in the evening when the air had decided to pretend it cared about human comfort. I set a small card table on the porch with lemonade because Mrs. Diaz likes to stop on her second lap around the block and say one line about whatever the HOA will fight about next. And I brought out the folder with the tomato magnet because sometimes I like to set it on the table and look at it the way other people look at photo albums. Inside are the deed, the auditor letter with a stamp that says filed, the school district PDF with my signature, the no trespass authorization, the HOA minutes, the signed agreement from the church office, and a single recipe card with my grandmother's handwriting that says houses are for families and use them as such, which I keep because I've decided that sentence means cook extra and keep a spare pillowcase in a drawer, but never let anyone use those words as a crowbar again. Tyler came by that night, alone, with 2 folding chairs that looked like they came from a trunk that has seen 100 Little League games. He set one down for me and one for him and said he had the month-to-month sorted and the kids had popsicles in a freezer that works and the landlord had fixed the dripping faucet like he said he would. He apologized again, quieter this time, and said he would understand if it took a while for Sunday lunches to feel like Sunday again. I told him I was willing to try if he was willing to keep paper in his vocabulary, and he laughed once and said, "Paper over talking any day." And then he asked if I had any tips for painting a bedroom without getting trim on the carpet, and I told him I buy the cheap plastic from the hardware aisle and tape it like I am tucking in a toddler for a nap. We sat long enough to watch the fireflies start up in Mr. Poe's yard, and when the neighbor's TV started in with the game highlights, I realized the sound no longer made me feel like I was about to be told something I didn't want to hear. It sounded like part of the block again. Like the air conditioner of the person across the street and the way the maple taps on my roof if the wind comes from the right angle. The ending is clean, not neat. Kelsey took a job 2 towns over in retail because the daycare needed a schedule to believe in and the restaurant tips weren't doing it. She stopped posting about family homes. After the pastor asked her to print one of her posts and read it out loud in his office, and she decided that was not a thing she wanted to do twice. My parents kept their chairs touching at lunch, and my mom now puts the lemon bars out after the hard part is over because she has learned when sugar helps and when it doesn't. Mrs. Diaz added a line to the HOA welcome packet that says overnight guests beyond 3 nights must be registered. Hydrants, even for 10 minutes, are off limits, and she underlined off limits in a way that made me smile. The school sent a pleasant email in mid-August thanking me for helping them keep their files clean, and the county auditor's office mailed a second letter with a simple line, "Application denied," that I folded once and slid into the folder because it is strangely satisfying to hold a sentence that's short after a month this long. If you're waiting for a perfect bow, I don't have one. I have a house that smells like lemon cleaner and cut grass and the faintest hint of cinnamon when my mother has been around. I have a doormat that minds its business. I have a folder that makes a new person's eyes relax when I hand it to them because the dates line up and so do the names. I did not light a match. I wrote dates. I let people who wear badges and keep clipboards use their fonts, and I built a very small, very sturdy boundary out of sentences. In late August, on a Thursday when the sky went the color of a nickel for an hour, and then remembered it was summer again, I sat on my porch with a glass of lemonade, and Mrs. Diaz came by and asked if the maple had behaved in the last storm, and I said it had, and she said she'd put on the agenda a reminder about lawn heights because somebody on Cedar Court keeps pretending grass grows itself. The neighbor's TV worked up a highlight about a left-handed bat the Reds had called up from Louisville, and I breathed in and out without counting, and when my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, "Kids want to bring over chalk this weekend and draw on your driveway, okay?" I wrote back, "Yes, chalk is allowed. Water hose is ready. No totes," and he sent a thumbs up and a small string of hearts his kids must have added without asking. I stood, swept a small circle of leaves off the new mat, and reminded myself that revenge in my family looks like this. Not a spectacle, not a punishment, not a quiet grudge arranged like a centerpiece, but a clean line in ink that says here is where my house ends, and here is where your story must carry itself.